GMO Labels, Misleading and Meaningless by Caden Purnell. GMOs are organisms with DNA that has been altered in a way that does not occur in nature to obtain a desired trait. By using genetic engineering in their production, GM crops are considered to be uniquely different from all other crops that have been genetically manipulated by humans for millennia. GMOs have been found to significantly increase crop yields and productivity, and are used for disease and pest resistance in addition to drought and cold tolerance. These traits allow farmers to grow more on less land and apply fewer chemicals, thereby offering greater benefits to the environment. Over 60 GM crops are currently approved for use in food and feed in the U.S., yet only 8 are commercially available in the U.S. In addition, corn, cotton, and soybeans have been the most readily adopted commercial GM crops over the past decade, as shown below. Something we are accustomed to seeing at the grocery store is the universal labeling of food products. Such include the food's brand name, type of food, the nutritional facts, and often the ingredients used. Studies have shown that most consumers have difficulty understanding the information provided by food labels, which proves to be important when discussing the implementation of GM food labels. Unlike general food labels, there is no universal conclusion on whether or not GM foods should be labeled. The European Union has created a framework for GM food labels via regulations that require labels on packaged food disclosing their nature. The EU also requires non-packaged GM foods to be in close proximity to a display indicating that the product is genetically modified. However, the EU's regulation allows food products containing less than 0.9% of genetically modified ingredients to not disclose this information to consumers. In the U.S., there is no current requirement for GM labeling, as GM food has been found to carry no inherent risk to humans or the environment. Therefore, the U.S. encourages voluntary labeling of GM and GM-free products, giving companies greater flexibility in marketing choices. Upholding consumer choice and the large demand by public opinion are large driving forces in enforcing GM labeling. Consumer choice allows buyers to make informed decisions about which products they select, and is considered an ethical right by many. Current stigmas associated with GM foods have many people seeking to avoid these foods altogether. While the majority of Americans fail to understand the most fundamental basis of what a GMO is, there is still an overwhelming, fear-driven public opinion that GM foods should be avoided, and thus labeling should be implemented to allow consumers to boycott them. This strong public opinion has been generated through political means in adherence to the erring on the side of caution. Studies have found that mandatory laws requiring the labeling of GM foods would cost a family of 4 roughly $500 to $800 in additional food expenses per year. Furthermore, those least likely to be able to afford GM foods would be most dramatically impacted by such labeling, thereby generating a greater socioeconomic burden on some of the most vulnerable populations in the U.S. Labeling also holds great potential to negatively impact growers through risks of economic losses, diminished public confidence, and legal costs. The process of producing labels can be costly, and farmers with non-GMO fields that neighbor GM fields face inevitable drift and contamination of their fields. Such cases can cause growers to face lawsuits and legal fees that can cost millions of dollars. GM labels are misleading and lacking meaning in that food items can still use GM techniques like mutagenesis without being considered GM products. And food items with trace amounts of GM ingredients will not be required to disclose this information. These products can then be marketed to consumers seeking to boycott GM foods. As shown below, products considered non-GMO have a new marketing opportunity, which has been greatly embraced over the past few years, causing a huge rise in profits of foods marketed as organic and GM-free. Often, the inclusion of additional labels on food packages serves the purpose of indicating health risks like allergenicity. However, GM labels provides no insight into health or environmental impacts associated with the foods. Since consumers already have a hard time sifting through the information provided on packaging, ambiguous labeling of GM food products leaves consumers wondering what the label truly means, and given the strong influence of public opinion, typically encourages consumers to form a negative association with the product. Labeling GM foods would require companies that fund research to make greater financial investments in legal costs. As a result, funding for research would diminish, thereby stifling the advancement of technologies and bodies of knowledge involving GMOs and slowing our contribution to future generations. A reduction in global exchange of foods has already occurred as a result of anti-GMO movements. With more and more countries adopting bans on the importation of GM products, further burdens would be placed on international trade and thus our economy. It's hard to quantify the significance of ethical concerns against economic and technological costs associated with GM labeling. Yet, the burdensome costs associated with producing such labels poses a threat to consumers, growers, economies, and technological developments, and it outweighs the demands for transparency of GM ingredients, since there are no risks associated with them. Just because consumers want to know something about a product doesn't mean that information must be disclosed, as long as there aren't any associated or substantiated risks. It's important to remember that highly sensationalized issues often garner the interest of consumers, regardless of whether or not there is any scientific basis. And this is backed by the fact that most consumers willing to boycott food products containing GM ingredients do so on the basis of imaginary benefits, not real benefits backed by evidence.